Hello and welcome. I have with me a very special guest today. It is KV Subramanian, the former Chief Economic Advisor of India and the current Executive Director of IAMF. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. It's a pleasure to have you on the show today. And my first question to you is that, when we were hearing the budget, there are two themes which largely came out. One is jobs, the other are ways to boost consumption. What do you think led Nirmala Sitharaman to choose these two themes? Was it a direct reflection of the results, election results that were announced about a month back?
Thanks a lot, Suchetana, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be chatting with you again. Firstly, I'm not a politician, so I don't want to comment too much on the political outcomes. And as is, I think those outcomes are driven by multiple factors. But from an economic perspective, I think the emphasis on employment is definitely very welcome. I will mention, let me put a few facts for our viewers to understand. If we look at the employment, what I have found is that some of the negative narratives, especially using the CMI data, have actually run ahead of the reality. If we use high quality data, like the one that PLFS puts out, the CLEMS database, which is a worldwide database, by the way, from the vantage point that I now occupy, I can actually vouch for that. The RBI report uses the CLEMS database, and shows that from 2004 to 2014, only about 2.5 crore jobs were created. In contrast, from 2014 to 2023, over that 10-year period, 12.5 crore jobs have been created. And even if one were to exclude agriculture, 8.9 crore jobs have been created, in manufacturing and services over the 10-year period. So that tells you on average about 89 lakh jobs have been created. And it's not just that these jobs actually are only from a quantity perspective, even quality overall. The economic survey that yesterday Anand presented shows that wages have also increased, about 10% in the 2021-22 compared to 2021. So I think overall, when we look at the data on employment, there has been good work that's been done. But I think, the doubling down on some of these good, outcomes on employment, reasonably good outcomes, I think is a welcome step. Let me also give perspective on, so many commentators are saying, that the 80 lakh jobs that, the economic survey talked about is a very large number. I think we have to keep it in context, because for one, as I said, if in the last 10 years, actually, and it has been the case that about 89 lakh jobs have been created every year, then 80 lakh actually should be possible going forward. Secondly, the 80 lakh is on a base of almost 60 crores labor force. So it is only 1.3% of the overall, labor force. For a large country like India, with the kind of population that we have, every number looks quite big. But I think it is important to generally put it in perspective. It's 1.3% is not a trivial number, but at the same time, it's not the kind of number that one would actually start, be getting fearful about. So I think from that perspective, employment, there's been good work, but the emphasis on skilling and on employment, both of which are very important. In some sense, they're actually two sides of the same coin, I think is really critical. I'm sure, Suchetana, you would have also done your internship. I did my internship, more than 2 decades back. When you do an internship in a large firm, you actually end up learning a lot. It's like learning by doing, all the stuff that you've learned in the classroom, you get to use some part of that in the real world, and thereby learning by doing happens. And especially the internships, focused on the top 500 firms is good, because that also provides a reputational value. Smaller firms then look at you attractively. And I think the broad emphasis on private sector to create jobs and the government to actually provide incentives for those, I think is absolutely welcome.
My next question was exactly about that, which is the employment-linked incentive that we saw. While it's a great start, but do you think that the provisions are a little vague? A, B, the thing is that, see, what we've seen with private sector, that demand has been very, very muted. So while the government has promised intervention in the form of, say, PF salary considerations, do you think that that is the much required nudge for the private sector? Do you see them actually taking action post the ELI announcement?
I think so. If you remember the Atmanirbhar Bharat Rozgar Yojana that was announced, and this was during COVID, it provided incentives to the employer for the provident fund to be paid by the employer to be taken care of, and this was done in firms with less than 1,000 employees, if you would recall. And research shows that that has actually led to about 60 lakh jobs either being avoided from being cut or actually new jobs being created. I think based on that, the incentives that have been provided now as part of the impetus on employment creation, I think are based on good evidence that this has already worked, and therefore they're doubling down on it. Together with that, I think the MSME credit guarantee scheme is very important because MSMEs typically, if you look at overall over the last 30 years, the proportion of credit that has gone to MSMEs, except during the COVID period where the ECGLS scheme really helped in increasing credit to MSMEs, but overall the trend has been declining as a proportion of overall credit. So I think the credit guarantee scheme, again, something that has worked very well, based on evidence from ECGLS. The government doubling down on that is I think important. I'll also add a few more. If you take the angel tax removal, which is very critical for the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And entrepreneurship is very important from job creation perspective as well. So the removal of angel tax is really critical there. At the same time, I think from a ease of doing business perspective as well, and I've been mentioning this, multiple times, the relook or reframing of the direct tax code is, I think, is an overdue measure, and I think it's good that that is being. Some commentators are saying, how in 6 months can this be delivered? Well, the fact is that in 2019, a committee of which I was a member had submitted a report where a draft tax code, fully laid out draft tax code has been, has been written as well, and that is actually available with the Ministry of Finance, so they can build on that work, to be able to deliver a much simpler direct tax code, which will really help on the ease of doing business front. Because typically it's tax, whether it's indirect tax or direct tax, that actually contributes a lot to the lack of ease of doing business. And this is also a very welcome step. Finally, I think I'd also mention the Mudra program, the threshold being increased from 10 lakhs to 20 lakhs. This is again, an area where there's been very good, credit creation and thereby also, value added and job creation. So I think that's also a very, overall a very good step. In sum, I think I would say that many of the steps that have been announced actually are far-reaching. The impact of these will be definitely seen, not only in the next few years, but in the years to come. Because job creation, and as this is something I've maintained, you would remember, Suchetana, that I've always talked about, job creation as a necessity for inclusive growth, so that the benefits of growth reach to all the people. I'll end with an example, sort of a real world. When I was young, if you remember, most of us coming from lower middle class, we used to have, let's say, somebody who would come and help us with home duties, right? They would work across, many households. So for instance, in our case, the help that would come actually work 10 households. So in other words, each of us lower middle class was providing 1/10 of a job, and that to a job of basically a help. In contrast, the rich dweller that who was there actually in our town, he had a very large establishment where he provided about 100 jobs actually, both at home and in his workplace, and these were much more well-paying jobs. In other words, it is actually people who create wealth, they are the ones who also provide jobs. I think this narrative has typically not been emphasized enough. I'm glad that the government is focusing on giving incentives to employers as well, because eventually job creation will require the employers to see basically benefits of them as well.
Right. Sticking on to the theme of nudging the private sector to do its bit, even the economic survey presented yesterday, it questioned the private sector's role, but they're actually lagging behind when it comes to capital expenditure as well, despite the various measures that this government has taken. The tax relaxation, somehow the private sector hasn't really stepped up. Do you think there's ELI now, then there is going to be a massive infrastructure push that we will see with the eastern states in focus? Do you finally see the private sector joining the capital expenditure bandwagon and helping the government, especially in the fiscal consolidation path?
So I think here again, Suchetana, we have to be a little bit more careful. The actual picture is more nuanced. If you look at, and I'm using the economic survey data itself, the capex creation, right? Private capex using the NSO data in 2023. The private capex increased by 19.8%. And if we look at 2024, this is using the Axis Bank research, which tracks about 3,000 firms, not only in the formal sector, but also in the informal sector. They also, have actually they show that this year's private capex is, slated to increase by 19.8%. If you look at the gross fixed capital formation numbers itself over the last, I think compared to 2019, where about 5 lakh crores private gross fixed capital formation was there. Now that has reached about 9 lakh crores. So I think it is important to while we of course want more investment coming in from the corporate sector, but I think it is not fair to say that they've not contributed their bit. I think we have to give credit where it's due. But the government is basically recognizing that private sector needs to do more. And I think that is something that I will emphasize. It has done its bit, but it needs to do more. And I think, I would also call upon many of the industry bodies, be it a CII, a FICCI, or an ASSOCHAM, to actually come together, put their heads together and focus on labor-intensive growth. Because for a country like India, eventually, it will benefit them because, when employment gets created, that actually adds to demand as well in the economy because disposable incomes actually increase significantly from employment. Nothing like employment in actually, enhancing the money that you have in hand, and it reduces uncertainty of consumption significantly. And that is important. So overall, I think instead of firms just choosing to substitute, labor with capital, I think, industry bodies like CII, and FICCI need to really, motivate their membership to focus on labor-intensive employment, because that is something that will help each one of them. So this is where I think the industry bodies need to recognize what we economists call the problem of commons, which is, every individual firm on its own may find it, let's say, beneficial to substitute, labor with capital. But cumulatively, if all firms are substituting labor, with capital, then you will not have adequate job creation, and thereby that will dampen demand in the economy and also, reduce the prospects for the corporate sector. This, problem of commons, or the free rider problem in some sense, is something that industry bodies have to recognize, and they must actually act to goad their membership to focus on labor-intensive employment.
Do you think there is any other step that the government should take to further nudge the private sector? Because while we understand from data that yes, private investment has been trickling in, but we all know that their balance sheets have never been better. Because again, what the government has done to clean up the banking system, etc. Now, in the budget today, there's a focus on eastern states, and the government says that it will invest in infrastructure projects there. Along with that, do you think it makes case for the government to directly nudge private sector by giving them some sort of subsidies? If you set up, say, a large factory in one of the eastern states, do you think that there is a bigger role that the government can play in nudging them directly?
No, I think there is adequate incentives already being provided. Take the PLI, production linked incentives. I think there is no stopping of firms, in Eastern India availing production linked incentives. If you and you are from that part, I've also lived there. If you take the eastern parts of India, their labor costs are lower because overall, the GDP per capita is lower. Land prices are also lower. And overall cost of living is also lower. So I think the opportunity for many of the corporates to set up bases in Eastern India is actually compelling. I think what is important, and here's where I would put the onus on states like West Bengal, for them to really focus on being business friendly. I've lived there in Kolkata, and this is an aspect, since the 1960s itself, West Bengal has sort of not been very good at enabling business. If the environment there is generally not very conducive for business. I think that is an aspect that state governments need to focus on, and I think some of the other northeastern states also should enable the environment, and that will really help in bringing more business to these states.
My final two questions to you first, sir, is that fiscal deficit at 4.9%, a very comfortable position for the country. Do you think that will prompt a rating upgrade?
You remember, Suchetana, I've actually written about this. I'm not convinced about the rating methodology that sovereign credit rating agencies use. Given the flawed methodology that they use, one doesn't even know what is it that is going to actually sort of make them change the rating. I believe that India should be at least rated A, if not double A. And we are languishing at triple B, and that tells you, so I think all bets are off on, flawed models that are used by the sovereign credit ratings. I have no hesitation in pointing that out. That said, let me also, give more, information and more insight to the rating agencies. The actual fiscal deficit number, in my opinion, as has been the case in the past years, will be lower than the announced number. And I'll tell you why, because the nominal growth rate assumption in the budget is 10.5%. And that is on a conservative, real growth estimate of 6.5 to 7%. In my opinion, real growth will be 7% plus, not a 7%. And inflation, even if it is only 4%, at 7%, real growth and 4% inflation, you will get 11.3% as the nominal GDP growth. So quite likely, I think the nominal GDP growth will touch close to 12% because inflation is likely to be about 4.5 to 5%. So when growth is higher, as a result, obviously the fiscal deficit number will be lower. I guess anywhere between 4.7, it's 4.7% of GDP is what the final fiscal deficit number will be. I think if these aspects and how fiscally responsible the Indian government has been, while giving impetus to growth, if these don't convince our rating agencies, I don't know what they're smoking then.
Right. My final question to you is that we saw the economic survey yesterday being worried about the irrational exuberance of retail investors on the stock market, and today we saw that the government has raised both rates of long-term capital gains, short-term capital gains, as well as they've raised the STT on F&O. Do you think that the government is also worried about the entire euphoria being shallow and it being a bubble?
So here again, let me make a nuanced observation. I think the participation of retail investors in the cash markets, which is investing in stocks or bonds directly, or through mutual funds, I think that is something which is very welcome because that provides significant amount of stability to the cash markets. If you would, if you would take the example from, let's say, deposits, in banks. If you take especially what is called CASA, the current account and savings account, about half of that money is very stable money. While some of us, I may, for instance, go and withdraw some money. You may go and deposit it. But overall, there is a base that actually is very stable. In a similar way, retail investor participation in stocks and bonds actually provides that stability and thereby enables the Indian markets to actually not be, dependent on the vagaries of foreign institutional investor investment. That said, I think it is, and I want to use this forum to also appeal to retail investors that F&O and overall derivatives is a very complex area. I've worked as, before my PhD, I used to work in derivatives research at ICICI, and I've actually done this for a living. Therefore, based on that experience, I strongly recommend that, for instance, if you have to really be able to price derivatives well, you have to understand stochastic calculus. And that is not something which, most retail investors understand very well. So they have to be cautious to understand people who are really good at mathematics, and areas like this who can price these products very well are the ones that are sort of the equivalent of sharks in this, in this market, and they'll eat up the small fish. So, it's really important that retail investors do not go into areas where, where they don't have expertise and thereby burn their fingers. Therefore, I think the increase in the transaction tax on the F&O segment is welcome. It actually puts some necessary sand in the wheels of retail trading in F&O. Yesterday, one commentator said very well, if you basically invest in the futures and options market, you would have no option but to have no future. I think that is something which is well said. So
Very
I
well
would
said,
reiterate
yes.
that for retail investors.
But I guess that is the fear that retail investors go into this market without much knowledge. And it's a fear that the SEBI chairperson, as well as now we realize with the STT increase, that Nirmala Sitharaman also has. I can't let you go without rating the budget on a scale of 5. How much would you give Nirmala Sitharaman's 7th budget?
So I would say anywhere between 4 to 4.5 out of 5.
Right.
You know, I said the out of 5 because typically people ask, out of 10, you're different, and you ask me out of 5. So I would say, so that translates into, 8 to 8.5 or 9 about, out of 10. That's so,
Right.
and I say that because it's actually a visionary budget. I think the first budget of the new government should lay out a vision for the next 5 years. And I think that is an aspect that the budget has done very well.
My team asked me the same question to give a number to this budget on a scale of 5. I said 4, and when they asked me why, I said the biggest reason is that Ms. Sitharaman has ensured she doesn't fall into the trap of populism. Just stick to the job that has been cut out for her. I mean, that's a huge achievement by itself, that you don't fall for the trap of giving big bang announcements in your budget.
I want to give some color to this, Suchetana, because it is, when you think about populism, what is the difference between, even for instance, the visionary measures indeed impact people positively, but they impact, with some lag. And I think one of the things that we all, having sort of experienced life, we can understand that, those measures that, generate long-term gain are far more stable, far more permanent compared to basically, let's say steroidal doses like the ones that are being given in some through freebies. Those don't last, so in some sense, to give a parallel, the budget actually is really, focused on enabling, the citizens to learn to fish for themselves very well, rather than just giving loaves of fish, and you're a Bengali, actually, that'll get done in a day. In contrast, if you learn to fish, you can actually help yourself for a lifetime.
True, true. Thank you very much, sir, for speaking to us and for taking the time out. Look forward to your next book that's coming up around the corner this month itself. Thank you very much and all the best.
My pleasure, Suchetana.
Thank you.